It seems to me that you're on a very fruitful path in talking about this. While you were speaking, I was thinking how this shows up in a lot of fields. So even, for example, in great literature. And the example that came to my mind is Jorge Luis Borges. Have you read any of Jorge Luis Borges' short stories? Okay. So it seems to me that this man's writing is itself guided by a fundamental question. And maybe this is true of other great authors. In fact, I would be willing to give you some other examples. Borges' question is this: what are the effects of infinity on human beings? Right? Because we have stories like Funes the Memorious. The guy falls, hits his head, and not only cannot forget anything, and not just from that point, I mean, he actually remembers everything, but his experience is as vivid, his memories are as vivid as the moment of experience itself. And so he's completely overwhelmed, and he just lies in the bed. He lies in the dark. And then we have, for example, The Immortal. And it's about a guy who is in North Africa in fighting, this is his earliest memory anyway, and fighting in North Africa in a Roman legion, and accidentally drinks the water of life, the water of immortality. And then after centuries and centuries, he seeks death. And he reasons that there must be an antidote, right? If there's a place where you can drink water, it makes you immortal, there's got to be some other spring or something that you can drink and allow you to die. But the problem is that his life just blends together. He can't separate anything out because
So is Borges looking for the advantages to finitude, let's say?
Yes, exactly. Well, let me put it a different way. What he is suggesting is that we are creatures of finitude. We are creatures of finitude in terms of our lifespan. We are creatures of finitude in terms of our intelligence, our memory. We are creatures of finitude in terms of our capacity to understand. So, for example, there's another wonderful story. It's about a Mayan priest during the time of the conquistadors, and they destroy the civilization. They throw him in a underground prison, and there are some bars, and on the other side is a jaguar. And he begins to recall that there's an ancient myth that the gods have inscribed in the world somehow a phrase that gives you complete omnipotence if you could utter the phrase. Anyway, and one day he's watching the jaguar and he realizes that its spots spell out somehow this phrase, which he then utters. And then he's looking for a way to destroy the conquistadors and restore Mayan civilization. But now he sees everything, this great wheel, the entire universe. He understands everything. And he has no longer any interest in doing anything because that knowledge simply,
It's complete.
It's complete, and it's totally irrelevant what's happening here on Earth or anything like that. My favorite is the Library of Babel, which is about this. The universe is a library, and the library has, hexagonal cells, and every cell has X number of shelves, and every shelf has X number of books of exactly the same length, written in 23 characters or 24, whatever it is, a certain number of letters, comma, period, space. And it's inhabited by librarians, and they're looking through these books, and they're trying to find some meaning. But
It's an infinite library.
It's an infinite library. And by the way, the mathematicians have done the calculations on this.
Yeah.
Right. So anyway, and like the most coherent phrase in any book that this librarian who's narrating it knows, and he's gone all as far as he can, is something like, "O time thy pyramids," right? So everyone starts looking for books because they realize, like, there's, I want to find something that will explain the meaning of my life or my purpose or something. And then the fundamental proposition of the library is formulated, which is that any book that is possible is actual in the library.
Right.
In other words, they can use like 1 million characters or something. So any combination of characters exists. That means that there is a book in this library that describes exactly this event. We're sitting here having this podcast. This is a possible book. It must exist in this library. Now, but there are also weird mathematical problems because if you think about it, it can't be the case that any possible book is actual because you can have catalogs of catalogs of catalogs so that it like mathematically it explodes. But anyway, so my point is, what happens in a universe where finite beings, finite rational intellects, try to find some meaning and encounter or are afflicted by infinity in some way. So just to go back here, that's Borges's idea. That
Well,
is,
it's a fundamental problem, right?
Right.
Because obviously we have some relationship with the infinite.
yes,
Right. It might be a relationship of negation.
Right,
I mean,
right.
but there's no escape from the conundrum that we're finite
right.
and
But-
faced with,
right.
and faced with the infinite.
Indeed. But the point I really wanted to emphasize in what you were saying is this question becomes a fertile soil for these literary growths. In other words, this is the question that animates his being as a writer, and it's highly, highly productive. So we all know that questions are highly productive.
Limitations. You see that in the creativity literature.
Exactly.
So there's a great, extremely comical example of that online. So haiku is a poetic form that has ridiculous limitations.
Yes, right.
And you might say, well, why bother with it? And the answer is, well, you can't play a game without rules.
Yes.
That's the answer.
Yes.
Okay. Now, but there's a spam haiku archive online. So it's only haiku that's only devoted to the luncheon meat. There's like the last time I looked at it's very funny. They're very funny.
That's pretty
And it's ridiculous. The
baloney.
MIT engineers made the archive, of course. And so there's 50,000 haikus there about spam. But then it's ridiculous, and it's supposed to be, and it's comical. But the point is that without that absolutely preposterous set of limitations, that whole universe of poetic beauty, you might say, and comic endeavor wouldn't have come into being. And so it's a very strange thing that there is a genuine relationship between finitude and abundance.
Yes.
Right? So there's a right balance between constraint and possibility that produces abundance. Too much possibility, there's nothing. That's Borges' point.
Yeah.
And then too much limitation, there's nothing, but there's some optimal balance. And maybe, it seems reasonable to propose that the fundamental issue in human life is how to get that balance exactly right. That's really what the ancient Jews were wrestling with when they were trying to figure out how you have a relationship with God. Modern people say, well, there's no such thing as God. Well, do you have a relationship with the infinite or not? You have some relationship. Maybe it could be a productive one if you could formulate it properly.
Yes. Well, look, so as you know in the Hebrew scriptures, God creates human beings. He's almost immediately disappointed with Adam and Eve. Now they're on their own. They get their wish, right? The serpent says to them, oh no, God knows you will become as gods. The best interpretation here, I think, is Maimonides, who cites another rabbi. And he says, well, the word for gods is Elohim, but it can also mean rulers. So they actually get what they wish for, because there's no need for rule in the sense that we understand it, that is limitation, law, and so forth, to order chaos in the garden, because you're in the presence of God. Now, once you're kicked out, now you've got a problem. And the problem of chaos that's internal to the human soul immediately asserts itself because Cain kills Abel. And of course, they screw up so badly.
The problem of misaligned aim, like Adam and Eve turn away from the proper aim. Yes, like the builders of the Tower of Babel. And
that's exactly right.
Because they no longer, this is exactly what happens with the Israelites when they demand a king. God basically says to them, well, if you conducted yourselves properly and maintained the covenant with the divine, you wouldn't need a king.
Right.
Like, we want a king.
And see, so after all these failures, and yes, the flood and the Tower of Babel and everything, so finally we speed up. In this part of Exodus, where the Ten Commandments and then the so-called Book of the Covenant and the rest of the laws are laid out, this seems to me to fit exactly what you're saying. God is limiting these human beings, right? Like, here you are, these freed slaves. We got to give you, some sorts of channels in which to move your desires, and stop signs and restrictions and so forth. And only within those 613 laws can you have a flourishing life.
Well, and it's even stranger than that in some sense, because first of all, you have the idea in the Garden of Eden that if your aim is proper, then you don't need, well, to set your own course, right?
Right,
Which
right.
Eve decides she's going to do
Right.
regardless. Once you set your own course and you're steeped in sin because your
Mm-hmm.
aim is misaligned, you need rules. Now, remember in the Exodus story, God provides the rules, first of all, directly from God, and then
Yes.
the Israelites go astray instantly, and
Sure.
then they get kind of a second rate, and you could argue in a way, inferior and more tyrannical set of rules.
Yes.
And that's because you could imagine tiers of proper aim, and
Yes.
God's hoping that the Israelites will aim at the highest conceivable, and they fail at
Yes.
that. And he says, well, here's something that's still high, and they
Yes.
fail at that. And he says, well, it looks like you guys are going to have to settle for this with me hanging around the fringes, and because that's all you seem to be able to manage. So,
Yes.
and I'm very interested in this idea of misaligned aim
Yes.
because I think the spirit of your aim answers your prayers. And so, okay, so now you talked about Borges, and you
Yes.
talked about the question, and that was part of a conversation
right.
we were having about questions
About
in general.
questions.
Yeah, so let's go
And-
back to the,
Yeah, so like the fruitfulness of the question.
yeah, exactly.
I mean, I think this is absolutely crucial. And let me say that there is a question that I know to be absolutely fundamental. And I know it to be fundamental because it shows up both in the Hebrew Bible and in Plato.
Okay,
In Plato, it shows up in the very first sentence of Plato's Phaedrus. And in the Hebrew Bible, it shows up when Hagar runs away from Sarah for the first time, and the angel comes to her in the wilderness. And the question is,